Never turn off. Get them up.
All right. Are we ready? Let's rock and roll. Here we go. You good? Yeah. Sweet. All right. So I'm going to start off with this map. We last left off with 1862. I'm going to show you what we've covered thus far. We have talked about Fort Sumter, the opening engagement of the war in April of 1861. We talked about the first Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. We also talked about Fort Henry and Fort Donelson early in 1862. We talked about the Union occupation of Memphis, the Union occupation of New Orleans in 1862. We also talked about the second Battle of Bull Run in 1862 in August. We talked about Antietam, which occurred in September of 1862, single bloodiest day of the war. And then we also talked about the very end of 1862, Fredericksburg. By the time we wrap up the lesson today, we will have covered all of these places. All right, and remember, we're only scratching the surface on all the places where this war took place. So we have wartime labor and politics, northern businesses totally retooled for the war. We have weapons production and supply production for the war effort. You ever heard of the term shoddy before? Like something is like shoddy or like no. Shoddy means like the material is like not good. There are a lot of people like producing not good material. Like one guy that made shoddy weapons was a guy by the name of J.P. Morgan. He sold weapons. Remember him? Have you heard of him? If you haven't, we'll talk about him later. He's one of the big tycoons in the post-war era. He sold weapons where soldiers' thumbs were getting blown off, which was not good. So not everybody was making the best material, but there are companies that start producing like rain jackets for the war effort. That company is Goodyear. They'll later make tires. Women play a huge role in the war effort. Women win wars. The North has a lot of women that are going to be able to go work in factories for the war effort. This has a large impact on the suffrage movement in the post-war era. Lincoln will enforce the first income tax during the war. Certainly not super popular. That never goes away. After the war, Congress and the president, not Lincoln because of his assassination, but later, one amendment will make the federal income tax law. You know what amendment? Oh, you're so close. It's 16. The 16th Amendment. So close. We'll talk about that later. The 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators. Commercialization and industrialization of agriculture leads to like mass production of the mechanical reaper and other farming products, which then resurrects the union movement that gets a lot of momentum in the post-war era. Remember, Lincoln and Congress, well, Lincoln's a Republican, Congress is now dominated by Republicans because most of all the Democrats were Southerners and they had left Congress to secede with the Confederacy. So this is going to be a massive expansion of the federal government. I'm just highlighting some of the major laws that were passed. There are a whole lot of laws that were passed during the Civil War. Like, for example, the Morrill Tariff Act, passed in 1861, doubled tariffs to protect northern industry. The Homestead Act was pretty brilliant. It allowed for land out west to be purchased cheap. You could put $10 down and buy up to 160 acres for $1.25 per acre. So a lot of people are going to go settle in the West. The Legal Tender Act, if you've got green money in your pocket right now, that's how that comes about. Legal tender, like greenbacks. Counterfeiting was a problem, though. So the Treasury Department established an anti-counterfeiting group that after the assassination of Lincoln will become the president's security detail. Who are they? Secret Service. The Secret Service. They were anti-counterfeiting. The Moral Land Grant Act will establish after the war our historic black colleges and universities like Howard and Hampton will be established. We also have, guys, anything with like state, tech, agriculture, military, agriculture, technical, polytechnical, those are all land grant schools. Virginia Tech, Penn State, Clemson, North Carolina State, North Carolina A&T, Texas A&M. If you're ever wondering what A&T stands for, agriculture and technical. If you're ever wondering what A&M stands for, agriculture and military. We'll talk more about the Moral Land Grant Act later. Pacific Railroad Act gets the planning phases going for the Transcontinental Railroad, but as you already know, and we discussed before, that's not going to be completed until after the war. And then the resurrection of the National Bank comes about, which will ultimately lead to more expansion in banking in the post-war era. Lincoln's power increased as a result of the war. There's a major shipbuilding program the South can't keep up with. The suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in the border states with the use of martial law. And Lincoln also took control of the railroads and telegraph systems to more rapidly move goods and soldiers, but to also stay informed about what was going on in the war front. Confederate President Jefferson Davis quickly took control of arms, supplies, and troops. There were very few generals that had kind of total power during the war. Really, only one specifically is kind of like off of a leash, and that would be Robert E. Lee. But most of all of the generals had to answer to Davis. He had served as Secretary of War prior to the start of the war. And Davis will ultimately be the first to pass a draft. I don't know if you realize this, but the Confederacy passed a draft before the Union did. And it was kind of weird because if you owned 20 or more slaves, you were exempt from the draft. So there was a lot of resentment in the South from non-slaveholding soldiers who were being forced to be drafted. This is actually why Georgia threatened to secede from the Confederacy during the war. So Davis also suspends the writ, and there's a lot of political infighting that goes on, not only within the Confederate Congress, but also within Davis's cabinet. There's a total, kind of like what we learned about Andrew Jackson. There's a lot of cabinet positions that totally move around during in the Confederate cabinet under Davis. So all the red dots are 1862 Moral Land Grant colleges. All the white stars are 1890. And then the 1994 Moral Land Grant colleges are mostly geared toward Native American education. So there you go. All right, questions up to this point about labor and mobilization for war. All right, Emancipation Proclamation. In the early months of the war, neither Lincoln and the Union nor Davis and the Confederacy really wanted to do much about acknowledging the slave issue. Lincoln was kind of hoping that everybody would be able to come back together. And both sides believed that the war was going to end pretty quickly. However, there were some outliers like William T. Sherman who were predicting that the war would drag on for an extended period. Guys, something really important to understand. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and now West Virginia, newly formed state during the Civil War, all 5 of those practiced slavery. So Lincoln's walking a bit of a political tightrope because he wants to exploit the slavery issue, but he also doesn't want to lose any of those states to the Confederacy. A lot of abolitionists were outraged by this, notably Frederick Douglass. Douglass becomes the first African American in U.S. history to actually consult with a president. He's encouraging Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Douglass is also encouraging Lincoln to recruit African Americans to serve in the military, which by 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, African American soldiers will serve. In March of 1862, just like almost a year into the war, just shy of it, Lincoln does have a proposal for the border states, and that was like an emancipation edict that if the border states abolish slavery on their own accord, then the federal government would provide slaveholders in the border states with a aid incentive of $300 per slave, but not in cash. What do you think they would offer that you could collect on later? That's a really good guess, but no, that's actually really good. Did somebody say it? Did somebody just say bonds? Bonds. No one bites on it, okay? So the radical Republicans in Congress in the early years of the war are going to pass 2 laws. Slaves used in hostile actions could be seized in the South, and in July of 1862, property of rebels could be confiscated so slaves could become freed in the South. This is where we start the whole contraband situation. And that is, now you have slaves who are like going to the Union Army to be liberated, and the Union Army is like, all right, we can't put you in service yet, so we're going to put you in the role of labor. There's a really interesting situation. One of the guys that pushes for this is a lawyer turned general by the name of Benjamin Butler, who the South called the Beast. And a Southerner came to Butler after Butler and the Union had taken these slaves and liberated them. And the guy's like, I want my slaves back. And I have the right to receive my slaves back because of the Fugitive Slave Act. And Butler's like, oh, sorry, sir. You're not a citizen of the United States anymore. The Fugitive Slave Act doesn't apply to you. So it's kind of a weird political game that's being played here. What really sends the Emancipation Proclamation into full force is going to be Antietam. After the battle, Lincoln visits the battlefield, sees the horrors of the war firsthand, removes McClellan from command again, and that is what's going to ultimately lead to Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. But the process had already begun to have that written. So it's going to be issued on January 1st, 1863. It's pretty much an ambiguous threat to the South, but it's a clear message that the war was being fought to end slavery. So what does it do? It defines the war as one against slavery. It became a war aim in the North, a moral cause to end the institution, and it was used to keep England and France out of the war, which it successfully did. What really kept England and France out of the war, though, was a combination of this and the Southern defeat, the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. That kind of puts a nail in the coffin for foreign recognition. However, they came real close to France acknowledging their independence, but France got themselves tangled up in Mexico and it didn't end up happening. Excellent job earlier, guys. It's not going to be the Emancipation Proclamation that truly frees slaves. What truly frees slaves will come later at the end of the war, and that'll be the 13th Amendment, which is proposed in 1864, and it's ratified by Congress at the very end of the war in early 1865. Has anyone ever seen the film Lincoln before? It was filmed in Richmond. It's all about the 13th Amendment. All right, questions about the Emancipation Proclamation? Everybody good? All right, turning points of the war in 1863. So in the late winter, early spring of 1863, things are going not great for the Confederacy in the West, but they're actually going pretty well for the Confederacy in the East. They're winning battles. They're planning a campaign to invade the North. A turning point battle, considered one of the Confederacy's last great victories, but also a pretty major turning point in the war, is going to be the Battle of Chancellorsville. Are y'all familiar with where Chancellorsville is? You guys know where Fredericksburg is, right? Like an hour north. If you were to go north to Fredericksburg and get off the exit on 95 and you drove about 10, 15 miles west, that's Chancellorsville. It's still heavily forested to this day. That's where this battle takes place. Lee is going to split the army in two. Jackson leads this crazy 17-mile march around the Union Army undetected and attacks the Union from its rear guard, just totally catching them off guard. And they just go into full retreat. It's a total mess. The battle lines are all over the place. They're totally routed. However, rain starts to set in that night, and what color do you think rain jackets are at this period of time, universally? Any idea? If they're actually canvas, but they're made with a rubber cover.
Black?
They're all black. Yeah. So the rain's coming down. Jackson and his officers decide that they're going to go on their own reconnaissance mission, and they head beyond enemy lines, and as they're coming back, they're actually shot by their own men. So Jackson has his left arm amputated. They rush him from the field by ambulance, which is basically a wagon, and he winds up at this place called Geneva Station where he's recovering. Gangrene sets in, and then what typically follows once you get that infection? It's a pulmonary infection. What is that? Anybody? It's called pneumonia. He gets pneumonia and he dies. Well, the reason this is a turning point, this is a significant Confederate victory, but the loss of Jackson, it's going to be devastating for Lee. Lee will famously say, Jackson has lost his left arm, I've lost my right. Well, had Jackson lived, Gettysburg may have never happened. So, now Lee's lost one of his core commanders. Now we move to Gettysburg. Gettysburg is a total accident. Lee has set his sights on a northern invasion. I'm going to test you on some fourth grade knowledge real quick. Lee's plan is to occupy the capital of Pennsylvania. What's the capital of Pennsylvania? No. But Harrisburg. Very good. I love it. It's Harrisburg, guys. He wants to occupy Harrisburg. Harrisburg's a major rail junction. It's an industrial center. And remember long, long ago when we learned about the Susquehanna River? It flows through there. But here's the thing. They never make it. Because both armies are in desperate need of shoes. And they both heard that there is a stockpile of shoes in Gettysburg. This is a really bizarre situation. On the first day of Gettysburg, the South attacks from the north, and the north attacks from the south. What they believed was going to be just a skirmish turned into the deadliest battle of the war. By the end of the third day, the estimate is somewhere between 47 and 51,000 are missing, killed, wounded in 3 days. So on day one, the Confederates take up the high ground position on what is called Seminary Ridge, and the Union takes up the high ground position on what is called Cemetery Ridge, controlling two really significant high points. On one end of the ridge, Culp's Hill, and on the other end of the ridge, Big and Little Round Top. On the second day of the battle, the Confederates are trying to take occupation of the ridge, and they are going to hit Little Round Top, but they'll be pushed back and beaten back, and they're held at Culp's Hill. And the second day of the fighting is horrifically brutal in places like the Devil's Den and the Peach Orchard and the Wheat Field. On the third day, it gets even worse because the Confederates are going to launch an attack on the center line of the Union high ground in what is known as Pickett's Charge. Has anyone ever been to Hollywood Cemetery before? Or do you know what I'm talking about? If you've ever been, there's this huge pyramid of stone in Hollywood Cemetery, and that is where a huge number of the Pickett's Charge guys are all buried in a mass grave. Because after this battle, there's so many dead, missing, killed, and wounded that the people of Gettysburg not only reach out to the federal government and the Confederate government, they also start to reach out to state governments and say, please come pick up your dead. Like, there are arms and legs sticking out of the ground. We need to move on with our lives. All right? So that's 3 days. Next day, all the way west to the Mississippi, the Union successfully takes occupation of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is not necessarily a battle. It is a siege. What does it mean when I say a siege?
They take over something?
Okay, you're on the right path. How do they take over? We learned about this when we talked about Cortez and the Aztecs.
Do they cut off the food, like all the supplies?
Very good. They cut off all the material getting in and out. Excellent job. The process of this actually started as early as March. The siege starts to take place in May, and they just drag this thing out until they totally got Vicksburg surrounded, bombarding the town. The people start to dig in and live underground. They're reduced to eating rats and dogs and cats and horses. This is a really brutal situation. Until finally, Vicksburg surrenders on July 4th. This will be within 2 days, within 24 hours, the two turning points of the Civil War occur in 1863. The Union victory at Gettysburg, forcing Lee and the Confederates to march back south, and the occupation of the Mississippi River and the occupation of Vicksburg. 6 months later, Lincoln will give the famous Gettysburg Address to commemorate a memorial and a cemetery at Gettysburg. Has anyone ever been to Gettysburg? Cool. Highly recommend you go at some point in your life. In this speech, it's like about 2 minutes, Lincoln says, 80, which a score means 20 years, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. What Lincoln is basically saying is, this is a war to preserve the Union. That's the Cliff Notes version of the speech. So, that's 1863. There's obviously a lot of other battles, but these are the ones I wanted to highlight. Questions about 1863? Is everybody good? Nice job, guys. All right. So, on the left, we have Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. On the right, that's the siege of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. Wonderful. Tension in the north and the south. How am I doing over here?
9 minutes, 20 seconds.
Beauty. All right. There's a lot of resentment over the draft. We call this conscription. This actually boils into a riot in New York City in the summer of 1863 in July, known as the New York City draft riots. Sadly, most of the people that were targeted in the New York City draft riots were free African Americans. Even a African American orphanage was burned to the ground. It's very horrible. It's very, very racist. Like they were aiming at attacking free African Americans as a result of this riot. There are a group of Northern Democrats, they called themselves the Peace Democrats, who are trying to get the Union to end the war and settle for peace, to just have two countries. This group was led by a guy named Clement Vallandigham, and this group was known as the Copperheads. Do you all know the original penny does not have Lincoln's head on it? It had the head of Lady Liberty. So they would wear these in their lapels, and they called themselves Copperheads, or people started calling them Copperheads. But their opposition referred to them as Copperheads because they were like venomous snakes, trying to bring an end to the war. What will ultimately happen, though, is the presidential election of 1864. Lincoln runs for re-election and wins in a landslide. This is truly the end for the Confederacy. Had the Peace Democrat candidate, George B. McClellan, who absolutely hated Lincoln, who had been removed from command twice, had he won this election, the South may have been able to hang on and sue for peace. But after Lincoln's reelected, they know that Lincoln's going to continue the fight. There are even people in the Confederacy, notably the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who's like, let's end this thing. To no avail. The war's going to drag out into 1865. The food situation in the South was absolutely horrible. There was a lot of people hoarding food. This led to bread riots in the South, especially in 1862 and 1863. There were bread riots in Macon, Atlanta, and Augusta, Georgia. The most significant bread riot occurred in Richmond on April 2nd, 1863, where women and children stormed in and robbed bakeries, grocery stores, and jewelry stores in Richmond. Ultimately, Jefferson Davis and a local militia had to put the bread riot down. The South also hated the draft. They hated taxes. Southerners resisted in a variety of ways. They evaded taxes. They dodged the draft. They deserted from the army. There's a really famous situation known as the Free State of Jones in Jones County, Mississippi. The people of Jones County, Mississippi, seceded from the Confederacy. Are y'all familiar with Floyd County, Virginia, in the mountains? I see a couple of heads shaking. They pretty much seceded. It got so bad that the Union and the Confederacy just neither one wanted to deal with Floyd because the people of Floyd County were like, rising up against both groups. On the left, we have the Copperheads. This is a political cartoon. And on the right, we have, bless you, the Richmond bread riots. This is where we pump the brakes today. By 1864, it's nearly over. But the Confederacy is continuing to fight on. They hope that they can drag this thing out. The re-election of Lincoln, not great for them. Lincoln and the Union just want to keep foreign nations out of the war. They've done so successfully up to this point. A turning point in the West is going to be when Grant and William T. Sherman and Union forces take control of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Has anyone ever been to Chattanooga? Hey, do you remember what river Chattanooga sits on? Sits on the Tennessee. Okay? It's okay. It's all good. I didn't expect you to know exactly what the river was. Guys, by controlling Chattanooga, this opens up a gateway to the south, notably to Georgia, notably to attack what industrial center in Georgia? Atlanta. Very good. So begins total war, scorched earth warfare, total destruction. Also, Sherman takes command of the Union Army in the West, and Grant takes command of the Union Army in the East. By the end of the war, Grant will command the entirety of the Union Army. So Sherman begins the march from Chattanooga to Atlanta. Atlanta will fall on September 2nd, 1864. Now begins a famous one that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, Sherman's March to the Sea. This will be from Atlanta to Savannah, from Savannah north to Columbia, South Carolina, and from Columbia, South Carolina, north to Bentonville, North Carolina. Total destruction. They ripped up railroad rails and had mules bend them around trees that became known as Sherman neckties. Everything was destroyed in its path. They also launched a similar scorched earth campaign in the Shenandoah Valley. In the east, that one was led by a guy named Philip Sheridan. In the east, Grant is going to lead what is called the Overland Campaign. The initial plan is to take Richmond, but Richmond's so heavily defended that they end up deciding to wrap around Richmond and bypass it to focus on Petersburg. In the Overland Campaign, battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, these are some of the most deadly battles of the war. The Wilderness happened on the same place that Chancellorsville had happened a year before. You all are familiar with where Spotsylvania is, right? Yeah. You guys know Cold Harbor, just north of Richmond? Horrific fighting. Also, when we get to Cold Harbor and Petersburg, this is where we start to see trench warfare. Petersburg is under siege for months. There's a very famous battle down there called the Battle of the Crater.
Is that where that?
Yeah, that's it. Very good. And you can still see all those siege lines. If you go to the crater, it's still imploded. So the thing about the crater is that a group of miners from Pennsylvania were basically digging a tunnel to blow up the Confederates. But the problem was they blew up the Confederates, but when the Union charged into the crater, they got stuck in the crater, and the surviving Confederates just surrounded the crater and shot them all. And most of the soldiers that were killed in the crater were African American. But yeah, good job. Guys, Petersburg and Richmond fall within days of each other. The Confederates burned Richmond to the ground. Do you guys know why Tredegar still stands, though? Tredegar was privately owned, and the owner of Tredegar sent his entire workforce out armed, and he said, anybody tries to burn my factory down, shoot them. And so, like, Confederates were like, yeah, we're going to burn. Oh, no, just kidding. We are not going to burn the factory down. Let's burn something else down. So most of Richmond burned to the ground and had to be rebuilt. Same thing happened to Atlanta. Within a week, Lee's army will be surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse. Yes. Is that a chainsaw or an engine or what?
It's big.
It's pretty wild. Okay, so Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. This is the end. There will be some other surrenders, like Joseph E. Johnston surrenders to Sherman at Bentonville. Kirby Smart surrenders at Palomino Ranch, Texas, later on. But this is the end. All right, so here we have William T. Sherman, Chattanooga to Atlanta, Atlanta to Savannah, Savannah to Columbia, Columbia to Bentonville. Charleston was spared. Strategically, it didn't make sense. This is Wilbur McLean's house at Appomattox. He was the guy who had his house occupied at the start of the war at Bull Run. He leaves Manassas and relocates to Appomattox, and that's where the war ends. And this is Lee's surrender to Grant. That's all I've got for today. Any questions? All right.